Churchill, ladies and gentlemen. And tonight's talk is by Major General Peter Williams. And by brief introduction, I'll give you a quick bio of Peter. 30 years in the Coldstream Guards, worked for 2 years with the Blue Chief Soldiers in Oman, served twice in Northern Ireland, commanded the 1st Battalion of the Coldstream Guards. He wrote speeches for the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. He served in Berlin 1973-75 as regimental intelligence officer, then went on to study Russian and German before spending 4 years in the 1980s in BRIXMIS in Berlin, effectively as a military spy. And since then, leaving the army, is currently the chairman of the BRIXMIS Association. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And first of all, are we going to dim the light at the front, if possible, a bit? I don't know, is that? We tried it earlier on. Aha, look at that, magic. Thank you so much. First of all, I apologise for not being here last year. It's a bit of a saga, and thank you to Rob Kershaw for standing in with Custer's last stand. It was my last stand as well on that occasion. I'm going to talk about life in BRIXMIS, in particular in the 1980s, and it's a story with a certain amount of this involved in it. I'm proud to say that I was twice accused by the Russians of behaving like James Bond. I took it as flattery. I'm not sure it was intended as such, but we didn't sadly have any dancing girls or really much in the way of the other things that James Bond enjoyed. But it was also an era when we were constantly aware of the secret police, the Stasi. This is a film, Lives of Others, but we always assumed that someone was paying attention to what we were saying at any time in East Germany. And it's really a story a bit like this. I think it's a bit like Top Gear on steroids. 3 men in fast cars behaving badly and paid by the Queen to do so. The story, though, starts at the end of the Second World War. This is Field Marshal Keitel here signing the unconditional surrender, capitulation. And the date, of course, is a curiosity. For us, we celebrate VE Day on the 8th of May, but by the time he signed the piece of paper, it had turned into the 9th of May in Moscow, which is why the Russians celebrate VE Day on the 9th of May. Piece of historical trivia for you. Germany was placed under the command, as it were, of 4 great generals, rather than under civilian administration by the victorious powers. So here you have the 4 great men into whose hands Germany was entrusted: Field Marshal Montgomery, General Eisenhower, Marshal Zhukov, and, as I always say, the unknown Frenchman who won the war. This is General de Tassigny. Germany divided into 4 zones of occupation, as per the flags on the map. And the most significant thing about this map is the location of Berlin. And it was about 120 miles, 200 kilometers or so from Berlin, traveling westwards to get to the British zone of occupation. So very much an island adrift in the middle of the Soviet zone. And of course, Berlin itself also divided between the 4 powers, with the western part of the city for the British, the French and the Americans, and the Soviets with the eastern sector of the city. And for the purposes of this talk, the other place of significance is Potsdam, lying immediately to the southwest, outside Berlin proper, but the imperial garrison town. It's a 1-day march from Potsdam to put down an insurrection in the center of Berlin. So the great men, these great commanders and their staffs were working to stabilize the situation, return to some sort of normality, and it was decided that some sort of liaison should be put in place. And liaison is one of the curious foreign words that we borrow into English, a bit like radio, which doesn't really mean anything very specific in English. It's a French word, obviously. Connection, exchange, communication. It's a loose term, and nobody really made any effort to define what a liaison was. But when the great men said, "Make me an agreement," the chiefs of staff went away and came up with a document. This is the document, the Robertson-Malinin Agreement, a refreshingly short document, and signed, or was it signed is another question, came into effect in September 1946 and lasted unamended until October 1990. And it authorized both of the British and the Soviets to exchange military liaison missions between one another. And it allowed 11 British officers, 11 British other ranks to be in the Soviet zone of occupation, and reciprocally 11 Soviet officers and 11 Soviet or 20 Soviet other ranks to be in the British zone of occupation. So that's what the document says. There shall be military liaison missions, and so there were. And what was the purpose of these military liaison missions? Well, there's a short sentence that simply says, the object of the mission is to maintain liaison. So no one ever defined liaison. Everybody nodded sagely and cut about their work. But it was a delightfully imprecise agreement which allowed for it to evolve nicely without amendment over the years. So this is the logo, as it were, of the British mission, British Commanders-in-Chief mission. There were two Commanders-in-Chief, one of the British Army of the Rhine and one of Royal Air Force Germany, with their 31 members in the mission, always known as BRIXMIS, because otherwise the title was too long for soldiers. Early in 1947, the French and the Americans made similar but not identical agreements with the Soviets to set up bilateral missions. As you can see here, the French had 18 people they were entitled to have in the Soviet zone and vice versa, and the Americans fewer still at only 14. We don't know why the Americans went for such a small number, but they did. But it meant the British with 31 had a sort of built-in capability advantage when it came to boots on the ground, as it were, in the Soviet zone. And these Western missions were based at Soviet invitation in the city of Potsdam, immediately outside Berlin. So everything was in place. Patrolling of sorts was going on by British teams, touring, as we knew it, touring in the Soviet zone before things all broke down. And sure enough, it was never going to last forever, this full power agreement, and the Berlin blockade and the airlift and so forth led to the breakdown of this slightly utopian system that had been put in place. The Soviets left in March 1948 and never returned to the full power meetings. But throughout this crisis, BRIXMIS and the American, the French missions continued to patrol out on the ground in the Soviet zone in order to report back on developments and reassure their capitals, London, Washington, Paris. And then in 1949, you see the arrival of two new German states. The three Western zones are brought together into the Federal Republic of Germany with its temporary capital in Bonn, and the Soviet zone of occupation became the German Democratic Republic. Nothing democratic, of course, about the German Democratic Republic, but East Germany and West Germany, to all intents and purposes, had all the rights of a sovereign country, except the four powers retained the right. One of the things they retained the right to do was to have liaison missions operating in these two new German states. And this was always a source of irritation, in particular to the East German authorities, that BRIXMIS and its sister Western missions didn't acknowledge the authority of the East German regime. So you move into a period of 40 years of Cold War. Here you see Mr. Khrushchev banging the lectern with his shoe and so forth, threatening to bury us or whatever. And I always enjoy showing this picture to school children. They always rather enjoy this one. This is Mr. Brezhnev embracing, kissing Mr. Honecker, the East German leader, and in the background, the top right corner, is Mr. Chernyenko checking on technique for later on when he became the Soviet leader. And of course, things then settled into fairly much a status quo, a stable situation with NATO on one side and the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union and its client states on the other side in Central Europe. So a standoff between these two great blocs, about 500,000 men on each side of the inner German border between West and East Germany. And in times of crisis, it turned out that these military liaison missions, which in some ways were anachronisms left over from the end of the war, were very useful. So during the great crises of the Cold War, like the 1956 Hungarian Revolution or in 1968 when the Czechoslovaks tried a similar thing, on both occasions the Soviets sent troops from elsewhere in Eastern Europe, but in particular from East Germany, down into Hungary, down into Czechoslovakia. And the three Western missions were able to report back to our masters, as it were, that they were indeed heading for Hungary. They were indeed going to Czechoslovakia. And this wasn't a cover for an invasion of the West. And so there was a degree of reassurance built into that. As was said before, I got served twice with BRIXMIS in the 1980s, once in the early 1980s and then in the late 1980s, but we left before the wall came down. This is the arm flash that we wore on our uniforms. And by the 1980s, this was the peak of the Cold War arms race. For more than a decade, the Americans have been challenging the Soviets into bankruptcy, really, in a high-tech race. And East Germany was filling up with a lot of state-of-the-art equipment, kit, as we knew it, stuff like this, an SS-23 rocket launcher. So my own experience in Berlin, as was said, started in the early 1970s, rather hard to believe it's more than 50 years ago, but it must be, when we were in the part of the garrison. And I've discovered that as the intelligence officer, it was a good way of avoiding the gaze of the adjutant. In those days, a long time ago, graduates were very rare beasts in the infantry, certainly in the foot guards. And it was considered there were only two jobs really appropriate for a graduate officer. One was to be the regimental signals officer. When it works, nobody notices. And when it doesn't work, it's all your fault. So one to avoid. And the other one was to be the intelligence officers, on the basis that if you think you're so clever, why don't you show it and be the intelligence officer? But Berlin was a perfect place to be a battalion intelligence officer. And then we moved on to Belfast, where the commanding officer said that we were not to grow beards. And so we grew some very curious and idiosyncratic facial hair, not very convincingly Irish, but as a sort of slight state of rebellion. And I was looking at this photograph the other day, and I'm wearing Doc Martin boots. I've quite forgotten that Doc Martin boots went back over 50 years as well. From there I moved to Oman, where we were allowed to grow beards, and so we did grow beards. And the important thing is to grow a beard before you become grey and old, if you can help it, possibly can. But why go to BRIXMIS? Well, I'd developed an early fascination for Russia, because the only book that we read outside the English literature A-level was Dr. Zhivago. My schoolmaster said, your parents only want you to pass the exam, and I know you're going to hate Shakespeare and Chaucer and things like that, but read this. This is a really good book. And then, of course, it's made into a film, and you have Julie Christie, an English actress, falling in love with Omar Sharif, an Egyptian actor, in a film made in Spain. And it says something for the magic of cinema that it could make us all fall in love with the idea of Russia. And of course, Julie Christie plays the part of Lara and made a lasting impression on many teenage boys, me included, to such an extent that I my daughter is called Lara, so teenage crushes can last a long time. But before you could get to BRIXMIS as a young officer, first you had to go and learn Russian. And we would go to that most Russian of places, Beaconsfield, and where for 18 months we struggled manfully to learn Russian and finished on a Friday and started German on the Monday. There are some people like Stephen Harrison here who are natural linguists, and there are other people like me. But we struggled, we learned alongside British and Japanese diplomats. And the lady in the middle in a red jumper, later Dame Anne Pringle, we swore she never forgot anything she was told by the teachers. It was quite spooky. And the Japanese diplomat said to me one day, I said to him, gosh, Russian's difficult, isn't it? And he went, no. I said, well, every adjective has 40 different endings you might need to use. Oh no, he said, no, English and Russian are really quite similar. I said, I don't think they are at all. He said, believe me, if you're starting from Japanese, they are. So I took his word for it. Not everybody, though, had to be a capable linguist. We also had other expertise. So on the left here, you have our SAS warrant officer, like a lot of people in BRIXMIS, not wearing his proper uniform, but wearing another one. And he was there he was the master on tactics and on equipment. He knew everything that was in the NATO catalogue that you could order, rinky-dink equipment. The sailor in the middle, a very rare beast. He'd been undercover for so long in Northern Ireland that the Navy had forgotten about him. And when he was offered back to them, the Navy said, we don't know what to do with him, sent him to Berlin. And a whole series of experts in the Royal Air Force who were air electronics operators and so forth, who understood about radars and wiggly amps and things like that. So quite a mixed bunch. And everybody then went off to Ashford, which in those days was where the intelligence corps was based, where for 4 weeks we trained alongside the American mission people, and some of the French officers came as well, and we learnt how to be military spies. So one of the most important skills we had was that of photography, and in those days photography, there was more to it than there is now. I've got one of the cameras here, by all means come and handle it later on. But you could only take 35 or 36 frames, and you had to rewind the film. Obviously you had to change, put a new film in, quite often in the dark. You had to mark the film so you knew which one it was in the seal. All sorts of things. You had to focus, all this palaver. And so it was important that we should learn how to take photographs properly. Generally speaking, the more senior the officer, the softer the focus. We had very low expectations that our brigadier would ever come up with really good photography, but we were always ready to be surprised. The other skill that was critical was that of recognizing equipment, all sorts of kit. We had to be prepared to identify and recognize thousands of different sorts of tanks and planes and trucks and guns and uniforms, anything that we might encounter in East Germany. That's what we were involved with trying to learn. So it was a sort of grown-up I Spy exercise in learning bits and pieces. And then coming together to learn how to live 3 men, which was our norm, 3 men in a car, generally speaking, operating together for 2 to 3 days. Not longer than that, because if you stay out too long, the information you gather starts to become stale. Better to get it back, pass it on, and other people can then follow up on the interesting stuff. And here, learning how to deal with a problem, you fall into a ditch, and how do you get out of it? There's no AA to come and rescue this. This is an army way of doing it, hydraulically with a winch. The RAF tours preferred to use an electric winch and kept their hands clean. BRIXMIS, so after 2 years, you finally got to Berlin and joined BRIXMIS. In order to keep 31 people on the ground, patrolling, as it were, in East Germany, you needed about 80 people altogether. And we were based in West Berlin, we lived in West Berlin, and we went forth into East Germany to do the job, led by an army brigadier, about 60% of us from the army, 40% from the Royal Air Force. The deputy was a group captain, and we did each other's jobs. We were completely joint. There was none of this, the Air Force do some things and the Army do others. We were fully integrated together. And you knew it arrived when eventually you were issued with a Soviet pass. And this was like a passport. If you had one of these, you could go from West Germany, or West Berlin rather, into East Germany. The Soviets also gave each of the three missions a villa in Potsdam as a sort of forward operating base. This is the British mission house, and we assumed that every room was bugged. This was our working assumption. And as you say, that we used to play games on the Russians who'd stand in the dining room in May and say, I thought the Russians were going to redecorate this room in time for the Queen's birthday reception next month. Frankly, if they're not here by Monday, it'll be too late. And then on Monday, there'd be a knock on the door and three men with paint pots, and everybody would look suitably surprised that they had, after all, remembered to come and paint. That was our assumption. They were listening to us in one way or another. But it was a base for traditional liaison work. So here's the British commandant meeting the Soviet commander-in-chief, a chance for man-to-man discussions to realize, get past the propaganda and speak to one another as normal folk. And so that was the sort of top end of military diplomacy. The younger officers in the mission, though, that wasn't really quite what we were after. And we would say to the Russians occasionally, our counterparts in a management organization in Potsdam, are you up for a party? And they would say, oh yeah, we're always up for a party, but we don't have any money. We could provide a venue. We could go to the Soviet Officers Club in Potsdam, but we can't pay for it. And we would say, that's fine, the Queen will pay for it. And our argument to the chain of command, our own chain of command, was that this had two advantages. The first one was that it would give us an opportunity to practice our Russian, and certainly my Russian improves with a drink or two. And also, perhaps we could build a rapport with the Russians, so when we next fell foul of them, which we did quite regularly, perhaps they would be nicer to us than they might otherwise be. I don't know really whether it worked, but it's a hard job and someone has to do it. And we were out and about making the best of it. We were also warned to watch out for beautiful women, either Russian women or East German women who allegedly were going to be throwing themselves at us, trying to get us to give up all our secrets or whatever. And personally, I'm a bit too thick to realize this, but I do know people who were not so much in Berlin, but were led astray by this sort of thing. More often, we preferred to go out, try and find a bunch of Soviet soldiers and invite them to come along to some pub and have a drink and tell us about life in East Germany. And while we were focusing on that, we were missing out on opportunities that were being put before us. But generally speaking, East Germany was a user-friendly environment. Very good ice creams, very good cakes. Most of the locals, if they saw us at all and thought about us, probably thought we were there somehow to control the Russians, who they didn't like. And a lot of Russians, if they saw us and thought about it, probably thought we were all there together with them to keep the Germans down, because they didn't like the Germans. So it was normally fairly much a win-win situation. But there was another side to liaison, and this was the reality of life, a bit like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Right from the very beginning in 1946, this had been seen as an opportunity for the collection of intelligence on what was going on just over the border in the Soviet zone and later East Germany. And this was the real job of the missions. For the officers, we had the military diplomacy as well, but for the other ranks, this was really the only thing they got involved in, although it's very exciting, but the gathering of information. And the Soviet army was a bit like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. Everything was a secret. Here you drive past a barracks and it says, welcome to the 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards, and you tick that off on your intelligence requirement. The answer's been told to you. But for a Soviet conscript soldier, for example, the true name of his unit was a state secret, and they didn't know what the unit was that they were serving in. And our job was to try and find all these pieces and put them together as part of this gigantic jigsaw puzzle. There's the theory of intelligence. Here it is, the intelligence cycle, much loved by the intelligence corps. I've never understood it, and it appears to have very little reality in life. We had very limited feedback. We were basically collecting stuff and blasting it upwards, and very little of it ever seemed to come back to tell us what it was we'd found. And the reality was rather more like this. We would go forth and hoover up anything and everything that crossed our front, and by doing so, this also minimized confirmation bias. When you go out looking for something specific and then you think you find it. If you're not looking for anything particularly specific, you find all sorts of things you're not looking for at all. In order to go and do this, though, first we had to go from West Berlin into East Germany, and we went from West Berlin first into Potsdam. This is the so-called Glienicke Bridge, and during the Cold War, the only people who regularly used the Glienicke Bridge were the three Western missions crossing over between West Berlin and Potsdam, but it was also famously used for the exchange of Soviet and American spies, and this is the Tom Hanks film, The Bridge of Spies, but that's almost literally the only other use of the bridge other than by the military missions. This is what it looked like from the Potsdam side, a whole mass of gates, chicanes and barriers, and this is to stop East Germans trying to crash their way through to a freer life in West Berlin. And as we crossed over the bridge, the Soviets would write down our details from these magic passes that we had. So you've arrived in East Germany. Where do you go? This is a typical sort of unprepossessing East German town. East Germany, not a very large country. It says 80% the size of England. And unusually for any country, the capital was in the middle. You think where London is, or Washington, or Beijing, or anywhere else. Capital cities tend to be somewhere inconvenient in a corner. We had the advantage of starting in the middle of East Germany, and it was about 4 hours driving fast in any direction to get to the edges of East Germany. If there was a speed limit, I'm not sure we ever discovered what it was, because we didn't acknowledge the authority of the East German regime. So somewhere out there, about 500,000 Soviet and East German soldiers, 5 great armies and an air army, a most impressive concentration of people. And we couldn't go just anywhere we wanted. The Soviets would place about a third of the country, it varied time to time, about a third of the country out of bounds to us. So these yellow splodges were areas that we were banned from, they were permanently restricted, and if you were caught inside one, you were sure to be made persona non grata, sent away, and all that training would be wasted. And if they put a third of East Germany out of bounds to us, we, the Allies, put a third of West Germany out of bounds to them. So everything reciprocal. So why these yellow splodges? Some of them covered the main tank training area, the Letzlinger Heide, live training. They didn't want us popping up somewhere down range while they were firing. Other areas had tactical nuclear warheads stored in them. Again, they didn't want us getting too close to them. And others might be where the East German regime leaders lived, and they didn't want us appearing at the bottom of their garden. East Germany was also full of signs on trees and concrete posts like this, mission restriction signs, which, if you read them, would appear to say that you can't go past them. Our 3 chiefs in charge of the missions many years before I got there had decided that because these signs were not mentioned in the 1946 and 1947 agreements, therefore they didn't exist and they didn't have any legal authority. So that for us was an advertisement that there was something interesting going on behind it, or they wouldn't have put a sign up. And they were souvenirs much collected by tours out and about. Later in the 1980s, the Soviets started to issue their own soldiers with a postcard like this. And it said, if you see a car with a funny number plate like this, ring up and say what they were doing. And it was a copy really of of cards that we had given British soldiers in West Germany for many years, and it seemed to appeal to the sneak in the British mentality that people like bringing up the Royal Military Police and saying they'd seen a Soviet mission card. But the Soviet officer said, we don't often get calls at all from Soviet soldiers saying they've seen you. And I said, why not? And he said, well, I think they're worried they will be visited by the organs of state security. And some man will come and say, how many men were in the car? What speed was it going at? What direction was it going in? And anyway, why did it take you as long as 35 minutes to make a telephone call? Why didn't you ring sooner? So much better to pretend they haven't seen you and crack on regardless. But he said, don't worry, we have plenty of East German friends who tell us what you're doing. Some of them would just be the ordinary police here. On every major road junction, there seemed to be 2 sleepy policemen in a car. And as you drove past, we assumed that they were radioing someone to say that we'd gone past. But the main people looking for us were the members of the Ministry of State Security, the Stasi, a vast organization, 100,000 of them for a population of about 16 million people. And one of the main directorates, Main Directorate 8, with 5,000 surveillance agents, was out and about looking for us and for Western diplomats. And here's a page from one of their training manuals, and it shows you all the disguises that you can carry in your sports bag. So in case you want to see how easily you can change your identity. I'm not sure how convincing it is, but that's what they were doing. And their job really was to check and see what we were doing. Were we doing what we normally did? Normality is quite reassuring to us and to them. Normality is reassuring, abnormality may be concerning. So are we doing what we normally do? Here you have a car, 2 young men in a car. There was a 10-year waiting list for a car in East Germany, so young men didn't have cars, and so 2 young men in a car smells a bit off. And when they get the camera out, it's game, set, and match. But they're really just trying to make the point that we're here, we know what you're doing, and if you got too close to a sensitive East German, as opposed to Soviet installation, they tended to start getting nasty. But most of the time, they were perfectly cheerful and just wanted to make it known that they were there, they were on to us. But they were also very good at surveilling us without us realizing it was going on. And this is a photograph from 1982. There I am, and me and the SAS warrant officer and our driver, and we're watching a train in the distance. And while we're watching a train, hopefully with tanks on it, while we're watching that, they're watching us and taking a whole series of photographs of us. And we had no idea that they'd been doing that while we were doing our bit. But you didn't have to go very far to find a Stasi agent. This was young Werner. Young Werner was the janitor, the odd job man in our mission house in Potsdam. And like all good janitors, he had a degree in electronic engineering, which may give you some idea what he was doing in his spare moments. We had, unusually for the British Army, fantastic equipment, state-of-the-art, anything and everything, because the Germans paid for it. That's one of the occupation costs liaison, this lovely loose term. All the bills went to the German government, who paid for them and couldn't argue the toss about them. So cameras in particular, of course it's an era before the digital camera, but in order to be able to cover all the photographic needs, we had to carry multiples. So we had 3 or 4 large cameras with motor drives, long lenses, and so forth. And we had the ability through image intensifiers to take pictures at night as well. This is a anti-aircraft gun going past. And for us, the important thing was to be able to, A, recognize the vehicle, but more particularly to be able to record the number painted on the turret. It was part of the order of battle. And so you could do that even in very low light. You could do it, this is with normal photography, uprated, and Stephen will recall in the late 1980s, we had a thermal imaging camera as well. This is a similar sort of photograph taken with a thermal imaging camera, The problem with that is there's always something that you don't get. And with thermal imaging, of course, the number painted on the turret is the same temperature as the rest of the turret. So you may get a better quality image, but you lose something, in this case, the numbers on the turret. It was that golden age before the mobile phone. School children always look at me completely blankly at this point. But there was a world without communications. And more than that, we had no radio communications at all in our cars. So we set forth completely incommunicado. And part of the advantage to this was we couldn't be tracked by anybody as we moved around the map, but more particularly, if we were behaving badly and the Russians rang up and asked the brigadier to explain what we were doing, he would say, I don't know where they are, but when they get back, I'll ask them and I'll come back to you and let you know whether they were behaving badly. So we had no comms of any sort at all. It was also an era before GPS, and so we still had to be able to read our way around the country on 1 to 50,000 scale maps. At any one time, you carried half the country in map strips in order to be able to check that you weren't suddenly disappearing into a yellow splodge on the map. And a great disappointment to young schoolboys in particular is that we didn't have guns. Guns don't solve problems, they only cause them, and in some magical way the other man always seems to have a bigger gun than you. And so much better to be known to be unarmed and, if necessary, go quietly. And also, although we had Women's Royal Army Corps clerks in particular in our headquarters, it was considered in those days inappropriate and unseemly. The thought of some poor young corporal like this being sent out 3 days in a car with 2 sweaty sergeants, or an officer and a sergeant, was thought to be beyond the pale. Now, of course, this wonderful modern world, they would be champing at the bit, wanting the same chances as the men, but it wasn't the case then. We had good vehicles, again paid for by the Germans. In the 70s and the early 80s, we had a number of Range Rovers. So we say if you want to go to a gymkhana in the home counties, a very good vehicle, but pretty good crap otherwise. They filled full of dust in the summer, they were cold in the winter, and everything on them broke. Driving cross country, they just weren't designed for it. We kept vehicles for 40,000 kilometres, and in 40,000 kilometres, a Range Rover, virtually every assembly of some sort would break. And they were then replaced by Mercedes Geländewagen Jeeps, the first one of which did 60,000 kilometres before anything went wrong. So quite different class of vehicle. But both of them big slab-sided vehicles, difficult to disappear in a vehicle that looks like that. And they seem to have a magnetic attraction for armoured vehicles that wanted to drive into them. But we hoped that they might be mistaken occasionally for a Soviet Jeep, a typical WAZ Jeep. And the interesting thing about this picture is on its bonnet there is a sign that says antifreeze is poison. You see, what an extraordinary thing to put. But Soviet soldiers, conscript soldiers, were so desperate for something to drink that they would drink the antifreeze. And so these signs were to try and persuade them not to do so. The other vehicle we used was the top of the range Opel saloon car, the Opel Senator. Looks like a fragile, normal car, but it had raised suspension. It had half a ton of armour plate under it to give it rigidity. It had four-wheel drive fitted to it, which was very unusual for cars in the 70s and the early 80s. 180-litre fuel tank. That's how to impress people when you pull into a petrol station. Three men and all their equipment. And all this lot somehow packed into the boot, plus all their own personal stuff. And you could do 200 kilometers an hour down the Autobahn in one of these vehicles. So a pretty special vehicle, and here is one on tour, as we would say, patrolling, showing its cross-country capability. This is the rear view of one of our cars. It's coffee break time, which is why it's stopped here. Distinctive number plates, which were meant to stay clean, sometimes tragically became muddy. Curtains on the back windows, you had to be able to take a decent photograph through that gap. And all the internal surfaces of the car covered in non-reflective material, so you didn't get stray reflections in your photographs. So quite a special vehicle in every sense. And every evening, the sergeant and the corporal in the front of the vehicle would insist on cooking curry in all weathers, balanced on a gas burner. And like a good health and safety Nazi, I used to say that you can't do this. You're going to have a terrible accident. You know, it's a petrol-driven car. And of course, irritatingly, they never did have an accident. But I did, and one day I poured a pint of tea into my lap and beat the world record for taking my trousers off. And it's at times like this you realize that out there, amongst us all, there are two sorts of people. There are nice, kind people who come and help you, and there are the other ones who stand back and take the photographs. We slept out in the field, as it were, in the early 80s. We sleep with our boots on, not, I think, the case by the late 80s, which just showed the world was improving. Sometimes in a nice barn like this, but ready to burst out like the Dukes of Hazzard if a convoy or something suddenly came along. But whatever the weather, eventually the driver, who always slept in the vehicle with the doors locked, would eventually evict the officer and the sergeant and say, I don't care how cold, how wet, how whatever, you're getting out because I need to go to sleep. And so it was, you know, it could be quite challenging. So here you have three men in a car doing the business. Driver, left-hand drive, looking out, he's responsible for security of the vehicle, the officer in the back taking the photographs, and the sergeant in the front right, who's the expert of all experts on recognition, and who shouts while the officer takes the pictures, photographs, the sergeant shouts into a dictaphone recorder. And the photograph shows him with the dictaphone in his right hand. In fact, his SOP was to hold it in his left hand. Why? Because this meant he could use his right hand to wave. So as you drove past a Soviet convoy or an East German barracks or whatever, the sergeant would wave cheerfully like this. And this gave the impression that the British were a friendly bunch of people, always waving, you know, cheerful. But also it's impossible to see a man in the back of the car taking a photograph because your eye is drawn to the waving hand in the corner of the windscreen. It's a very good piece of deflection. Unfortunately, there's no money in it for the defence industrial sector, but it's, you know, it's something that actually works. And just to prove that it does work, here is a Soviet truck coming past us with not one, but two Soviet soldiers waving cheerily back at us while we manage to take their photograph and collect all the information we want about that vehicle. So what were we trying to do? First, we're going to try and work out, where are they? Are they still in the barracks where they normally are? So there's rather strange custard-coloured paint, typical Soviet paint. Are they still there? Yes, they are. That's a tick in a box. That's good. What are they? Here is a train coming past. These, in fact, are air defence vehicles. We would take a photograph of every vehicle as it went past, interested, of course, in the numbers painted on them, but on the equipment itself. And then we would race ahead, get to the other side of the railway line somewhere and take a photograph of it coming past and get the other side of the train. And this was all useful for building order of battle intelligence on the other side. More particularly, how good were they? They had nice equipment, but were they good at using it? And because we were all from the infantry, the artillery, the cavalry, whatever, we had a good feel, I think, for whether people were competent in using the kit they had. So this is a T-80 tank. In its day, the rinky-dinkiest thing anybody had ever seen, 45-ton sports car, massive gun, silent as it comes towards you, whistles as it goes past. And I always say, if you're a boy and you're not moved by this, you need to see Matron, because this is really what it's all about. But what are their intentions? Much more difficult to tell what people's intentions are, but we knew that every 6 months they started a new training cycle. So you're looking over a wall into a barracks here. It's February. This particular unit normally go on exercise in March. Are they getting ready to go on exercise? Probably that's normal, that's good. If you're expecting to see them there and they're not there, that's abnormal, so maybe more significant. We did a lot of train spotting. I still can't drive past a railway station without looking at for streaks of rolling stock, but you can tell a lot, even if there aren't any vehicles there, by looking at the ramp. Has the concrete been damaged by vehicles loading on the ramp? Are there any of these cattle trucks? Because wherever Armour moved, there were cattle trucks with the crewmen sitting in the cattle trucks to guard the train. And we would hover by rail crossings at night in order to take pictures of trains as they came by in whatever detail we could manage. But not everything you see do you understand. And so the aim was to take a photograph regardless of whether or not you knew what it was. So here is a piece of equipment has come past, and we had a tarpologist in the mission, and his job was to look at things like this and try and work out what they were. So it might be that those are hinges on the side of it, perhaps it's a pontoon that opens out. He would be able to measure all these things and tell you if he'd ever seen it before and say what it was, and if we'd never seen it before, it was something new. Armour tended to go by rail, but everything else moved on the roads. And in order to move large numbers of vehicles without using the radio, the Soviets used human regulators on major junctions. So here's a junction. Somebody put this picture up and said it was young Vladimir Putin doing his military service. And suddenly the internet was full of things saying, you know, have you seen this picture of Vladimir Putin doing his conscript service? They used these young men, they just dumped them on the side of the road and told them when the convoy comes along, push it in that direction. So you can do this on radio silence, but more particularly the road signs were in our alphabet. And so this stopped the whole convoy having to come to a grinding halt while the young officer in the front vehicle tried to work out what the road signs were saying. So a very efficient system and much enjoyed by certain people in the audience this evening. Stephen chatting up one of his regulators to see whether the convoy's come already or whether it's going to come. And eventually the regulators stop the traffic and allow the military vehicles priority onto the road. We spent a lot of time driving past convoys. There were theories about whether it was safer or better or whatever to drive from the back past a convoy or from the front going down it, but in fact you rarely had choice. But while the officer was taking photographs to identify what sort of vehicles, these are rocket launchers, they're on driver training, number plates tell you things. So while you're going down a convoy, you've no idea how long it goes for, but you feel slightly more nervous, shall we say, the longer the convoy. But the driver, our driver, was always looking to see that somebody wasn't coming down the other side of the road towards you. And it was his job to bail out if we were all about to crash. And again, on the road, we could manage photographic cover at night as well as by day. Again, I think this is the Stephen Harrison show this evening, but here's another one. You don't have to train British soldiers to, we don't use crude words like steal, but collect things. I would say that even paper clips are magnetic to soldiers. But our aim was not only to take photographs of everything, but if we could take it home, we'd take it home. On this occasion, this tank projectile, which Stephen seen being fired the day before, when he collected it on the range, it hadn't blown up, it was fizzing and he had to put it down. The thought of 2 days in a car with a fizzing projectile, probably not a good idea. But there were questions that could be answered. So these strange boxes that you see on tanks in Ukraine, explosive reactive armor, the theory is that the incoming missile fired at the tank hits one of these boxes and the box explodes and neutralizes the incoming projectile. And we were tasked 1 week with coming home with one of these boxes, and within 4 days, one of our touring patrols had found one of these boxes and sent back to London. But hugely significant from the development of our own attack against their tanks. You have to be someone of faith, I think, to go to war in an armoured vehicle nowadays. And here you have an armoured vehicle covered in those boxes, which quite clearly don't work. All these convoys tended to be heading either to a training area or to a deployment area. Every unit in East Germany had its own piece of forestry where they were going to deploy to in preparation for war. And these pieces of forestry had vehicle pits that they could then throw camouflage nets over the top, and bunkers. So here is one with a couple of bunkers in it. We had people in the mission who were skilled in the dark arts of entering locked buildings. And what you hope as you're breaking into one of these things is there isn't someone like that on the other side of the door. But generally speaking, there wasn't. And this is the inside of a typical regimental level bunker. The tall thing is a stove. On the floor is an air filtration canister. And so we would take them home too, send them to Porton Down, where someone would look at them and work out what poison gases they were designed to extract from the air or whatever. All interesting technical intelligence stuff. And whenever an exercise ended and they'd been in one of these places, they tended to be a bit scruffy with their paperwork. They might stuff it into the stove, in which case, and not burn it completely, so we would retrieve that. And there's even a piece on the floor there. So all this is all part of this gigantic jigsaw puzzle. Here, for example, a radio operator's log, and he's written down all the incoming and outgoing calls that he's received. Someone in GCHQ may have heard the same transmissions, all ties up together. The Soviets also had very good maps. They had very good mapping of the whole of Europe, including Britain. And a map helps you, if you recover the map, it gives you some idea of the scenario that they're probably exercising about. This, in fact, is the Soviet General Staff map of Colchester and Braintree in Essex. But so whether they were about to invade Colchester, I don't know. One of the things we were particularly interested in was what they lived on in the field. So this is a typical Soviet dry ration pack for a soldier on exercise or on operations. Lots of bread, a couple of tins of vegetables, maybe if he's lucky a tin with some meat in it, some tea leaves, and some sugar. But the critical thing that's missing from this was loo paper. That's the one thing they didn't issue their soldiers, was loo paper. And it was our job to go around and collect whatever it was they had been using as loo paper. Here is an American doing this very job. You can tell he's an American because he's wearing rubber gloves. Real men don't wear rubber gloves. What did they tend to use? There were two things in particular that were interesting to us as alternative loo paper. One was the daily newspaper, Sovietskaya Armia, the daily newspaper. And for us, it dates the dump in the woods, basically, as to when they've been there. So here is a newspaper, and from Friday, the 16th of October, 1987. So the person who left it there must have been there then or soon thereafter. It degrades quite quickly out in the open newsprint. So that was useful. And the other thing that was useful were letters from home. So here's a letter from a mother in Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan to her little boy serving in East Germany. I hope he read it before he reused it. But for us, it was interesting that it had been sent to a field postal number, like a British Forces Post Office number, in this case 83102E, I don't know what it was. If it was one we normally found in that training area or that piece of forestry, that was normal. If we hadn't seen it before, it was a little bit more significant. And then we'd take it back to Berlin, dry it off, give it a bit of brush, and write a report on it. It was a curiously addictive habit which you could get into. You couldn't drive hundreds of thousands of kilometers a year without having accidents and other hazards around and about. So there were frequent chases. Here's a Soviet vehicle. Not all of them pretended they hadn't seen you. Some of them were very persistent in chasing you. This is when the four-wheel drive worked, and when the photographs through the gap in the rear curtains come into its own. Shootings, on the other hand, were infrequent. here is one of our cars with a bullet hole in the boot. Generally speaking, you should be able to drive past someone once and potentially collect the information without them realizing you've done it. If you come back a second time, you deserve to have somebody wave his fist at you and tell you to go away. And if you come back a third time, frankly, you deserve to be shot at. This is unprofessional. Too many passes at the same target. We were detained. We didn't use the word arrested. Detained fairly frequently. And here's a typical detention. There came a point when you could run no further. But they didn't often break into the cars. So this is a photograph, a secret police photograph of the stuff recovered from one of our cars. They didn't break in often because they didn't want us breaking into their cars in West Germany. So that maybe was an advantage we had. We always kept the doors locked and they had to use real violence to get into a vehicle. And this is a video camera from that era. I've got a video camera and a still camera here for anybody who's interested afterwards. We couldn't retaliate against the Soviets. Here's a British staff sergeant being manhandled by an angry Soviet officer. If he's going to punch you, let him punch you, but don't punch him back. You would automatically be made persona non grata for using violence against our hosts. But East Germans, on the other hand, were fair game. And this is a photograph from 1981 of one of our Range Rovers, which had been pursuing a rocket artillery train down the map. The Soviets got bored of it popping up at every level crossing, told the East Germans to get rid of it. And by the time this photograph was taken, the East Germans had deployed 14 police cars and the Range Rover had hit 10 of them. The brigadier was summoned to speak to the Soviet colonel in Potsdam, who said, "I regret to say that one of your young officers and his tour have done damage to our East German allies." The brigadier said, "Well, I don't know, they haven't come home yet, but of course, when they do, I'll investigate further, I'll come back and tell you about it." And the Soviet colonel went, no, that won't be necessary. We have told you, and we're not interested hereafter. And we never paid for damage to the Soviets, or to the East Germans, rather. But you couldn't always stay lucky. This is August 1982. The new chief, Brigadier John Learmont, later General Sir John, great man, gunner, and his driver, Corporal Benny Boland. And I was summoned by the ops officer and told, take the new brigadier out on the ground, give him a good time, let him take a few photos, doesn't matter if they're not in focus, give him a good time, and then he'll support us when we're next in the poo, because we were quite regularly. So we set off. For the first 6 hours or so, the secret police were there all the time. Is the new brigadier doing what the last one did? Is this normal, or is he somewhere different? And then we thought we'd lost them. And so we moved across the map towards the inner German border, which is the yellow splodge down the left-hand side there, avoiding the yellow areas. And I said, we're going to go west, sir, and then we're going to go south into the Harz Mountains, and then we'll go back to Potsdam. It'll be a good day out. What, of course, I had failed to notice was that where these two arrows come together was a small village called Artenstedt, and just outside Artenstedt was an East German Air Force radar site. So we ploughed merrily on, and the brigadier went, look, he went, there's an early warning radar site. And I said, yep, thank you, sir, well spotted, but don't worry about it. We'll crack on anyway. And we drove into the little town of Artenstedt. And as we came out of the town of Artenstedt, he went, look, he said, there's one of those signs. And I said, that's right, so well spotted, but remember, it's just an advert for something interesting. Oh, right, he said. So we drove on a bit further, down the picture, but up the map, up the hill. And I said, I suddenly was getting a bad feeling in my waters. And I said to him, I think probably if you put the camera away, sir, that'd be a good idea. And I said to the driver, and if you could put your foot on the ground, that would also be a good idea. Because I had assumed the radar site would be 500 meters, a kilometer away from the road, but there it was, bang slap alongside the road. So we were pretty much committed at this point, and as we passed the near end of the radar station, I saw a man in the mirror behind us jump out and throw a barrier across the road. So, it's not going terribly well at this stage, but you just hope to stay lucky. And we almost got to the front gate. Maybe you'll see a little red car there some years later. I thought if we can get past the front gate, we'll be okay. And we almost got there when a mummy and daddy sized 10-ton truck came flying out from the main gate and drove straight into us. So here we are with the 10-ton truck planted in the side of the car, and the car should have rolled, but it was saved by a fruit tree there on the side of the road, and so it just squashed a bit. And miraculously, the three of us were not shaken, stirred, but not harmed. And lots of armed men rushing around and all sorts of drama. Anyway, once our heart rates had gone down a bit, I said to the Brigadier, what we need to do, sir, is show them that we're on the moral high ground here of sorts. We'll get out of the vehicle and we'll do what British people do at a time like this. We'll have a brew. And so there's a whole series of secret police photographs of us making 3 cups of Nescafe. All the while, though, the secret police photographer was getting closer and closer and becoming really quite a persistent hazard. And this is the last photograph that he took, because half a second after that, I went oof with my cup of coffee and got him from head to toe. It was very satisfying as the coffee settled. But as it settled, I thought, oh, bother, maybe I've rather overdone this. And I turned to the Brigadier and I said, I'm so sorry, sir. He's such a horrid little man. He had it coming to him. And Brigadier went, it's a good thing you did it. He said, because if you hadn't, I was going to. I said, no, really, sir, you really mustn't throw coffee over them. Anyway, cut a long story short, here is the car. Good bit of German engineering, drove onto the recovery trailer, but was a write-off. And I went to see the operations officer. I said, I brought him back. I think he had rather good time, actually. And the operations officer said to me, what sort of an idiot are you? Something like that, anyway. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you must know about that radar site. I said, I've never heard of it before. And he said, well, the Americans had the same thing happen to them. And their one rolled and their officer was badly injured. This was some years before. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I didn't know. And he grabbed me physically by the ear and dragged me. We had a corridor map of the whole of East Germany. And there, halfway down the corridor map, was a sign saying something like this. And so it just proves that prior preparation and planning prevents poor performance. Not everybody could be as lucky as we were. There were 2 fatal incidents. A Frenchman was killed in a deliberate ramming, just as ours was a deliberate ramming directed by the Stasi. Here he is, dead next to the vehicle. Mariotti is the man on the left who was killed. His officer was very badly injured and taken off to hospital by the East Germans. But the other warrant officer in the car refused to leave the scene despite being badly hurt, because he was convinced the Stasi would pump alcohol into Mariotti's body and claim that he'd been drink driving, which he wasn't. And we discovered many years later, after the wall went down, that the Stasi had shared 1,000 marks bonus for having killed Mariotti. And this is the receipt, as it were, finance officer's receipt for this blood money that had been paid to them. That was bad enough in 1984, but the next year there was a real drama when an American major was killed by a Soviet sentry. There he is, lying next to his vehicle. And the Americans turned just 2 men in a vehicle because they only had 14 magic passes, and his driver was threatened at gunpoint that if he got out of the vehicle, he too would be killed. And Nicholson bled to death. And this was the first crisis of the Gorbachev era. Gorbachev had just become the leader of the Soviet Union. A week later, he's having to deal with the American government over a Soviet soldier killing an American officer. Things move on, and then suddenly President Reagan appeared in front of the Brandenburg Gate, calling for Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall. And we're all thinking, why on earth would you do that? This job is a bit like winning the national lottery. Every day was so exciting. Why would you want to stop something like that? But the American president knew better than us. And 7th of October 1989, the 40th anniversary of the founding of East Germany, and there's no kissing between Gorbachev and Mr. Honecker, the East German leader. The message has been delivered that your days are numbered, and East Germany isn't going to last much longer. Just before that, in May 1989, the British ambassador in East Germany, Nigel Broomfield, had been asked by Douglas Hurd to write a paper on the future of East Germany. And he said, I came to 2 conclusions. One was that East Germany, when it collapsed, would collapse very quickly. And the other conclusion was it's not going to happen anytime soon. And he said, as in comedy, so too in diplomacy, it's all about timing. And then suddenly the wall was breached. And for us, the most significant thing was that the following day, for the first time in over 4 decades, East Germans were able to move freely across the Glienicke Bridge from Potsdam into West Berlin and to and fro. The border defences were quickly dismantled, and in October 1990, so less than a year after the wall had been breached, all the Allied missions in East Germany and the Soviet ones in West Germany were stood down. The Americans had a parade. They have 50 state flags and lots of different armed services. They like a parade like that. The British went for a rather more British version, everybody together for a barbecue, their favourite OP out on the ground, but it was the same end. And then we were all meant to be happy that, hello, they were all meant to be happy that East Germany, or the two Germanys had been reunified. I'm nearly there, but finally, Anne and I went back to Autenstedt, to the radar station. It's now nearly 14 years ago. But the radar had been replaced by a wind turbine, very good 21st century approach to these things. And what I wanted to do was meet the driver of the 10-ton truck. We worked out from the Stasi reports what his name was. Here it is, Hartmut Luderitz. And I sent a message to him, would he meet me at the radar site? And his response was, yes, but only if you accept I was only acting under orders. Classic German defense, so that'll do nicely. So here we are, as I always rather unkindly say, I'm the one in the hat. I said to him, so what happened? He said, I was the chef on the radar site, but that day I was the duty NCO, and it was the duty NCO's job to drive the ambush truck. And the Stasi rang up, they said they're about 30 minutes away from you, activate the ambush. So he said, I sat revving the truck for the officer on my right, and when the officer said, go, we charged across the road. And he said, and at the last minute I touched the brakes. Oh, yeah, I like his story, but anyway, slammed into it. So I said, so what happened to you? And he said, we got 2 weeks extra holiday for slamming into you. And I said, as a matter of interest, I wonder what would have happened if you'd killed us. Oh, he said, we knew what would happen if we killed you. We were on a promise of 6 weeks extra leave and 1,000 marks bonus. So it does sound as sort of a common pattern. And finally, of course, much the most important people in the mission were our wives. And this is Anne's pass. And you can now get your secret police file. And I applied for mine, and it arrived eventually, 125 pages of confirmed criminality. And but Anne, who's a German interpreter, seized it from me and said, I'm the German speaker in this family, and off she disappeared. And I thought a little more of it. And about 20 minutes later, she came back, she said, it's all right. I said, what do you mean it's all right? She said, no, it's okay. I said, what is okay? And she said, well, you know the East German ladies who worked in the mission house, all of whom were obviously reporting to the secret police, Ms. Anne and our daughter. She said, so I said, well, what did they say about us? And she said, it's there on the last page of your file. It says, Major Williams and his wife have a very nice little family. They always call each other darling. And on that note, I rest my case, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Julian. So usual story, 15 minutes break, so 5 to 9 back in the seat.